Tonight, we begin with a shakeup that administration insiders had feared, immigration experts had predicted, and career officials had quietly prepared for. A reshuffling that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that exposed deep fractures within the Department of Homeland Security. Hours that left deportation operations in disarray across multiple states. Hours that revealed just how fragile the administration's immigration machinery had become. What the White House did today crossed a line that even loyalists inside the agency had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, career officials did not stay silent. They responded with alarm, with frustration, and with unprecedented leaks to the press. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal press releases, just signals, that the White House was preparing something disruptive. The administration has been aggressive on immigration, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a doctrine. But what set off alarm bells inside the Department of Homeland Security this week was that the pattern went silent. Officials who monitor personnel decisions and operational directives know the indicators. The sudden cancellation of scheduled briefings, the unexplained reassignment of senior staff, the arrival of political operatives in operational roles, the sudden freeze on internal communications. All of that went quiet. And whenever this White House goes quiet on immigration, it means something disruptive is about to happen. Sources tell us that by Monday evening, at least 3 senior officials at Immigration and Customs Enforcement had been informed their positions were under review. By Tuesday morning, 2 had already been replaced. No press release, no explanation, no transition plan. Just a phone call and a directive to clear their desks. Early Wednesday, sources within the Department of Homeland Security confirmed what they described as a wholesale leadership purge, including the removal of officials who had not been reassigned in over a decade. These are the kinds of personnel moves that administrations only make when they are signaling something very specific: ideological realignment, operational acceleration, or preparation for something controversial. Career officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that the White House was changing its immigration posture. And when any administration shifts immigration strategy without explanation, even by small measures, Congress pays attention. What made this week different was the timing. These changes came just days after a high-profile deportation operation in Chicago resulted in chaos. With the wrong individuals detained, families separated without documentation, and local law enforcement blindsided by federal agents operating without coordination. The fallout from that operation was immediate. Civil rights organizations filed emergency injunctions. Local officials held press conferences condemning what they called federal overreach. And inside DHS, career officials reportedly urged the White House to pause and reassess. Instead, the White House did the opposite. They accelerated. The internal memo circulated by acting DHS leadership tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Officials after officials described the White House's latest moves as chaotic, counterproductive, and perhaps most importantly, legally vulnerable. But political strategy only works if the target hesitates. Career officials did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated we've seen in this administration. Here's what we know. Within hours of the first termination notices being delivered, at least 4 senior officials requested meetings with the DHS Inspector General. These weren't informal complaints. These were formal requests for investigation, the kind of documentation that career officials only file when they believe something improper has occurred. Meanwhile, sources on Capitol Hill confirmed that Democratic members of the Homeland Security Committee have already begun drafting subpoenas. They want documents, they want testimony, and they want answers about why experienced officials were removed at the exact moment deportation operations were experiencing their worst failures in years. Tonight, CBS News confirmed that the White House has initiated a search for replacements for at least 5 senior positions at ICE and Customs and Border Protection. including the acting director of enforcement operations, who had recently been praised internally for reducing procedural errors by 30%. The White House moved before critics could organize. They removed the acting director of field operations. They removed the senior counsel for detention standards. They removed 2 regional coordinators who were reportedly pushing back on accelerated deportation timelines. In other words, the White House targeted the institutional knowledge, the experience that would have made operations sustainable, the officials who understood how to execute policy without creating legal liability. This is what made the internal warning so urgent. The White House's moves weren't just political, they were operational. They represented the kind of leadership vacuum that could cripple enforcement if left unaddressed. And career officials, understanding that fully, responded with documentation. Not recklessly, not publicly, at least not at first, but strategically. They didn't leak classified information. They didn't hold unauthorized press conferences. They filed formal complaints. They requested Inspector General reviews. They created a paper trail that will be very difficult to ignore. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Analysts now believe that the White House's latest moves were designed to test the loyalty of the DHS workforce after weeks of internal pushback. The administration wanted to see whether career officials would fall in line or resist. But instead, the opposite happened. Career officials didn't capitulate. They documented their concerns in ways that were so thorough, so procedurally correct, that even White House counsel took notice. You don't get this administration's attention easily, but today, career officials did. Former DHS officials speaking with NBC News under anonymity described the White House's approach as decapitation strategy, a way to remove institutional resistance before launching more aggressive operations. But career officials proved today that they remain both professional and prepared. Their filings were not only legally sound, they were timed so precisely that the Inspector General received them before the White House could install replacement leadership. That timing matters because it shows institutional resilience. It shows that the Department of Homeland Security is not simply a political tool. It is an institution with procedures, standards, and officials who understand their responsibilities. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the leadership vacuum. ICE field offices in at least 4 states reported confusion about chain of command, forcing delays in scheduled operations. Customs and Border Protection supervisors in Texas confirmed that guidance documents had been rescinded without replacement, leaving agents uncertain about detention procedures. Immigration court liaisons operating in California reportedly suspended coordination meetings, pending clarification of new leadership priorities. This wasn't just personnel shuffling. This wasn't just political theater. This was operational disruption. This was institutional destabilization. And institutional stability is the one thing the administration has struggled to maintain since taking office. For every enforcement action they have announced, procedural failures have countered with something that undermined their credibility. The Chicago operation was just the most visible example. But sources tell us there have been others. Operations delayed, detained individuals released due to paperwork errors, coordination failures between federal and local authorities. All of this was happening before the leadership purge. Now, with experienced officials removed, the situation may get worse before it gets better. Remember, this administration thought that aggressive personnel moves would intimidate career officials into compliance. They thought that removing senior leadership would accelerate their agenda. They thought that experience could be replaced with loyalty. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Career officials are documenting concerns through proper channels. Congressional Democrats are preparing oversight actions. And immigration operations are experiencing delays that undermine the very goals the administration claims to prioritize. This is not the first time an administration has tried to reshape an agency through personnel purges, but it may be one of the most visible examples of how that strategy can backfire. What makes this moment so significant and so volatile is that the White House's latest moves happened at a time when the president is under immense political pressure. Immigration hardliners want faster deportations. Moderates want fewer headlines about enforcement failures. Legal advisors want fewer lawsuits. And political strategists want fewer images of chaos before the midterm elections. The president is balancing these demands while also managing an agency that is increasingly resistant to political interference. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The Chicago operation was supposed to demonstrate competence. Instead, it demonstrated exactly the kind of dysfunction that makes voters nervous. And rather than address that dysfunction with process improvements, the White House chose to address it with personnel changes. That is a political calculation, not an operational one. The White House statement, now circulating through official channels, was designed to signal that the president is not satisfied with enforcement results. Press Secretary Communications said plainly that previous leadership was inconsistent with the president's enforcement priorities. That is political language for, they weren't doing what we wanted fast enough. You don't usually hear that tone from any White House unless they are trying to shift blame. But what the statement did not address was why operations have struggled. It did not acknowledge resource constraints. It did not acknowledge legal challenges. It did not acknowledge the procedural failures that career officials had warned about for months. Instead, it blamed the very people who had been trying to prevent those failures. Meanwhile, the ranking Democrat on the Homeland Security Committee addressed reporters in a brief but pointed statement tonight. She said, "What we're witnessing is not leadership. It's chaos." She said, "You cannot run a law enforcement agency by firing everyone who tells you something you don't want to hear." And she said, "This committee will use every tool at its disposal to understand what happened and why." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a committee that understands just how high the stakes have become. Subpoena authority is real. Oversight hearings are coming. And the White House has just created a paper trail that investigators will spend months examining. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The leadership purge wasn't isolated. Along with the personnel changes, the administration also announced new detention quotas that career officials say are unrealistic. DHS legal counsel reportedly received instructions to expedite removal proceedings, regardless of case complexity, and field offices reported increased pressure to prioritize quantity over procedural compliance. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. When any administration moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Sources believe this is preparation for a major enforcement operation in the coming weeks, something designed to generate headlines before the election. But without experienced leadership, that operation carries significant risk of procedural failures, risk of legal liability, risk of exactly the kind of chaos that just embarrassed the administration in Chicago. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the White House is preparing for a high-profile deportation operation that requires leadership willing to take legal risks. Another is that the administration is attempting to blame career officials for failures that originated from political pressure. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that the administration is attempting to purge institutional knowledge before investigators can interview key witnesses. But today, career officials took that option off the table. They didn't wait for subpoenas. They didn't wait for investigators. They didn't wait for permission. They documented everything they could while they still had access. What we're watching now is a test of institutional resilience. The White House wants to see whether they can reshape DHS through personnel pressure. Career officials want to demonstrate that procedures matter more than politics. Congressional Democrats want to establish oversight precedents, and the courts want to ensure that enforcement actions remain within legal boundaries. All of these interests are now colliding in real time. Tonight, we've heard from sources on Capitol Hill who are now reviewing the timeline of personnel changes. They say the pattern suggests coordination, not reaction. They say the removals were planned before the Chicago failures became public. And they say the administration's decision to accelerate the purge is likely part of a broader strategy intended to consolidate control before oversight intensifies. But career officials are not retreating. In fact, career officials are cooperating with investigators at unprecedented levels. Their response today, documented, procedural, and legally sound, sent a message to the White House that institutional memory cannot be erased with a phone call. And it sent a message to Congress that witnesses are willing to talk. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the White House hoped to achieve. But what we do know is the career officials' documentation was timely. It preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost. It established a record that investigators can follow. And it demonstrated that not everyone inside government is willing to sacrifice procedure for politics. What happens next will depend on what the White House does in the coming days. If they pause and reassess, this moment will be remembered as a correction. If they accelerate further, Congress and the courts have already shown they are prepared to intervene. Career officials have shown they are ready to testify. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the White House Communications Office appears to be hesitating. The press briefing room is quiet, too quiet. And when this White House is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, this administration learned something they should have understood from the beginning. You cannot run an agency without expertise. You cannot enforce laws without procedures. And you cannot silence an institution by firing its leaders. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Career officials have drawn a line. Congress is watching. And the chaos is just beginning. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.